Today, in my presentation, I will be giving you a closer look at Sigmund Freud, who is one of the most influential and also controversial figures in psychology. Often called the father of psychoanalysts, Freud introduced ideas that forever changed how we think about the mind, behavior, and therapy. In this presentation, I will talk to you about his early life, his career, some core theories, techniques, his influence on modern psychology, and some of the criticisms that surround his work. Freud was born on May 6, 1856 in Freiburg, which is now part of the Czech Republic. When he was 4, his family moved to Vienna, where he lived for most of his life. However, Freud did not enjoy living there. He often spoke about his dislike for the city, especially because of the widespread anti-Semitism he faced there as a Jewish man. Freud was extremely bright from an early age, where he attended a competitive high school and stood out in subjects like science and languages. He first considered becoming a lawyer, but later switched to medicine as he was drawn to the biological sciences. He enrolled at the University of Vienna, where he began exploring biology, anatomy, and physiology, all interests that would later shape his psychological theories. After earning his medical degree, Freud worked at the Vienna General Hospital, where he specialized in neurology. During this time, he did become engaged to Martha Bernays, and after a long engagement, they married and had 6 children. His youngest daughter, Anna Freud, went on to become a respected psychoanalyst that you could definitely read more about. Interestingly, early in his career, Freud was a strong advocate for the medical use of cocaine. At the time, he believed it could be used to treat depression, pain, and ironically, even addiction. Freud believed it had legitimate medical uses and even used it himself to increase productivity. However, as the dangers of cocaine became more evident, Freud did abandon his support for it and distanced himself from his use. Outside of work, Freud was a passionate collector of antiques, especially artifacts from ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt. He also did love dogs, and in his later years, he did form a special bond with his Chow Chow Jofi. He often sat in on therapy sessions with Freud, and Freud passed away in London in 1939 at the age of 83 after a long struggle with oral cancer. Freud introduced several groundbreaking ideas that changed how we understand the mind. One of his most important concepts was the unconscious mind. He believed that a large part of our thoughts, feelings, and motivations lie below the surface or outside of our awareness, but still affect how we behave. He introduced the idea of psychic energy, which is inspired by principles in physics. He saw mental energy as something that could become blocked or repressed, which would lead to psychological symptoms. To explain this, he used the iceberg metaphor, and that metaphor is that the conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg, while the unconscious makes up the much larger part beneath the surface. Freud also believed we were driven by 2 opposing forces, eros, which is the life instinct responsible for love, creativity, survival, and thanatos, the death instinct, which is associated with aggression and self-destructive behavior. These instincts are always in conflict and influence much of our behavior. Freud's most well-known contribution is psychoanalytic theory, which led to a new form of therapy, psychoanalysis. This approach focuses on uncovering hidden, unconscious thoughts and feelings, especially those rooted in childhood experiences. Freud developed tools like dream analysis, where he explored the symbolic meaning of dreams, and free association, where patients said whatever came to mind to reveal patterns and repressed thoughts. He also proposed a structural model of personality that includes the id, ego, and superego. The id is our primal side, driven by the pleasure principle, so it wants instant gratification. The superego is our kind of internal moral compass, shaped by our society and parents. And the ego just kind of acts as the rational part that balances out the id and superego and helps make realistic decisions. And according to Freud, psychological health depends on a strong ego that can manage the tension between the id and the superego. Freud also believed the ego uses defense mechanisms to protect us from anxiety and inner conflict. These processes are unconscious and often distort reality to help us cope. Some common defense mechanisms include repression, which is pushing painful memories or thoughts out of our conscious awareness, projection, which is attributing one's own feelings to someone else, reaction formation, which is acting in a way that's opposite to how you truly feel, and sublimation, which is redirecting unacceptable urges into productive or creative outlets. I did list all of the defense mechanisms here, but just a few examples listed on the slide. Freud did consider sublimation the healthiest defense as it benefits both the individual and society. Freud also introduced a theory of psychosexual development where children pass through 5 stages as they grow. The first stage is the oral stage. It's pleasure centers on the mouth. That is from birth to 1 year old. The second is the anal stage where pleasure comes from controlling bodily functions from ages 1 to 3. Phallic stage is where children become aware of their genitals and develop attachments to the opposite sex parent. That's ages 3 to 6. Fourth stage is the latency stage where sexual feelings are dormant while children focus on friendships and learning from age 6 all the way to puberty. And then finally you have the genital stage where sexual maturity and adult relationships begin, which is from puberty to the rest of your life. Freud also introduced the Oedipus complex and briefly discussed the Electra complex, which was actually Jung's theory, the Electra complex was. And this is where children supposedly develop unconscious sexual desires for their opposite sex parent in rivalry with the same sex parent. So the Oedipus complex, for example, boys develop this unconscious sexual desire for their mother in a rivalry with their father. These ideas, especially because of their gender biases, have been heavily criticized and are not widely accepted today, but they still had a major influence on early developmental psychology. Despite the controversies, Freud's influence can still be seen in many modern areas of psychology, such as in psychodynamic therapy. This is a shorter, more practical version of psychoanalysis. It still focuses on exploring unconscious conflicts, but it's more structured and time limited. Schema therapy, created by Jeffrey Young, combines Freudian ideas with cognitive behavioral therapy to help clients recognize and change harmful thought patterns rooted in childhood. And then you have neuropsychoanalysis, which is pretty new. It uses brain imaging technologies like fMRI to explore how unconscious processes can affect brain activity and behavior. This field does aim to provide scientific evidence for some of Freud's original concepts, as we'll get to that. Freud's theories were often seen as not empirically valid. He also his work also shaped theories by Erikson, Bowlby, Klein, and Winnicott, who focused on topics like identity, attachment, and childhood development. While Freud's legacy is strong, his work has not gone without criticism. Like I said, many of his theories lack empirical support, meaning that they can't be scientifically tested. His ideas about women and homosexuality reflect very outdated views that are no longer accepted, and some of his concepts, such as penis envy or the Oedipus complex, are seen as biased and overly focused on sexuality. Because of these issues, modern psychology has moved towards more evidence-based approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, but Freud's work still plays a foundational role. He changed the way we think about childhood, emotions, and the unconscious mind, and even those who disagree with him are often responding to a framework that he built. So, to sum it up, Sigmund Freud was a complex and controversial figure, but his ideas changed the direction of psychology forever. Concepts like the unconscious mind, defense mechanisms, and early childhood development are still part of how we understand human behavior, and though many of his theories have been revised or replaced, Freud's impact is everywhere. You can see it from therapy practices to neuroscience to education. We still talk about him to this day. He laid the groundwork for modern psychology and did help bring the inner workings of the human mind into focus.